Hi there, my name is Stephanie Bendixson. I am a Australian television presenter and video game critic. I've presented a few broadcast television shows here in Australia about video games, one of them Good Game, and I'm currently presenting a show called Screenplay on both YouTube and television. I'm hosting the business of indie games, so you'll see my face a fair bit if you haven't seen it already. So thanks so much for joining in. We're all ready to learn more about the business of indie games development. Today I'm here with Kate Edwards. Welcome, Kate.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Kate has had a mega career in games until very recently was the executive director at the International Game Developers Association. Kate is currently a board member for our charity partner as well, Take This, that's supporting solo indies and teams in burnout to find ways to develop their games and hang on to their sanity and health, which is very important. Kate is a geographer, writer, and content culturalization specialist. She founded and led the geopolitical strategy team at Microsoft and has consulted on many game and non-game projects for BioWare, Google, Amazon, and many other companies. She had to create a discipline within Microsoft for launching games and products in new regions. It's a huge job and goes way beyond translation and subtitles. And for trial and error, Kate has learned how to support teams and launch their games and products with success, taking into account religion, culture, political climate, symbols, customs, and more. And she's got some great stories to tell about her time at Microsoft, including decisions being escalated to Bill Gates. So thanks so much for being with us here, Kate. It's an incredible bio that you've got. So we're looking forward to talking to you today about how indies can nail their international launches and potentially avoid major flops or getting the culture wrong or offending or alienating gamers, which would be disastrous.
Absolutely.
So I suppose my first question would be, what's the story behind you launching the geopolitical strategy team at Microsoft?
So basically what I did, I was working on my degree, my PhD in geography at the University of Washington in Seattle. And so I had done, just for context, I did my master's degree on using virtual reality for cartography, and that was way back in 1991. So way back in the early days of VR. And so I'm still pursuing that in my PhD, and then we got a call from Microsoft, and they said we need a cartographer to come over and work on Encarta Encyclopedia. This is way back in 1991, right after I finished my master's. And so eventually I ended up being there as a contractor. I helped with all the maps on Encarta World Atlas, and a lot of other products at the time, and was given a full-time position as a geopolitical specialist to help them with all the sensitive boundaries and islands and all that disputed stuff around the world. And as I was in that position, I started getting a lot of questions from all over the company because they knew that I was there as this geographer. They said, "Hey, is it okay to use this flag? Is it okay to use this gesture? Is it, all of these other like cultural questions and political questions?" And I could answer a lot of those. So it was clear to me that there was a need for an internal resource in the company to help with all of these kind of issues across all the products and all the locales. So that's why I created this team called Geopolitical Strategy. And I created it in, that was 20 years ago, 1998.
Were there some tough lessons that you had to learn as part of that journey?
Oh yes, all kinds of tough lessons. Working in a large company like Microsoft, especially in those days, it was a great place to be. And I think it still is. It's gone through some rough times, but I think it's come out of it. But what was great is that there was an innovative spirit. And like being able to create the geopolitical team, I think in some companies that would be unheard of to some degree to be able to take that initiative. But one of the hard lessons is just being absolutely persistent. I know it's a cliche that a lot of people hear, like be persistent and you'll reach your dreams. But there's truth to it. Persistence really works. I didn't just come up with the idea for the team and get it approved. It took me 9 months of going around to different leaders in the company and different VPs and pitching my idea to them until finally one of them, he agreed instantly, and that was Paul Moritz, who was he was the only VP at the time who was not from the US. He was from South Africa, so I think he completely got it right from the start.
Yeah, interesting. What's the best, what's the best of the geo launches that you've seen, I suppose the most successful?
Well, you mean in terms of games or just?
Yeah, let's focus on games for the moment.
Yeah, I mean, there's been some really good ones out there. I mean, especially in recent years, because as companies have begun to get more aware of the importance of inclusivity and appropriate representation of different cultures and ethnicities, and they've done a much better job in, say, the last 5 years than they have in the previous 25. And that's just a sign of our times. You know, some companies like Ubisoft do a really, really good job of it. I mean, they actually reach out to communities to get their input. You know, another game that did very, very well at this is a game called Never Alone, which is about an Inuit girl with her little snow fox that follows her around on these adventures. The entire game takes place within the mythology and the culture of the Inuit people, including the language. So you hear the game is done in the Inuit language with subtitles. So it's just very, very well done. And you know, that kind of stuff, we're seeing more and more of those types of games these days, really good launches that, you know, just kind of take these things into account. So if they're going to pick a theme that is cultural or something related to like the real world, they actually do their research and do their work to make sure it's done right.
You talked about decisions being sent right up to Bill Gates. I mean, it sounds like there are some pretty serious risks when launching products internationally.
Yes, there are many, many risks. I mean, one of the things that a lot of developers fail to realize, especially indie developers, because indie developers don't have a huge army of lawyers like Microsoft and Sony and these big publishers. So when you make a mistake, if you release a game that has something that, say, for example, it pisses off China or another large country, or even small countries, if it offends them politically or culturally or something like that, a lot of times, I mean, the great majority of the time, developers don't intend to do it. They just made a mistake. There's nothing intentional about it. But the problem is that intent means nothing to these governments. So if they see it as something that you did intentionally, even if you didn't. And so you have to defend yourself and figure out, you know, so what are we going to do here? Do we want to sell our game into this market? Or do we just want to like run away and pretend we never tried to go into this market? There's a lot of problems with that, because if you make a mistake in that market like that, if you go back, so say a few years later and say you want to sell your game there, a lot of times governments remember this kind of stuff. They'll be like, yeah, we remember you guys. We remember what you did last time. No, you're not coming in here. Sorry, you had your chance. So you have to be very careful. I mean, once you launch a game, your content is ubiquitous. It's around the world. It's everywhere. Everyone's going to see it. It's exposed to a broad multicultural audience instantly. And so you have to think about that before you finalize your content and put it out there. I mean, is this really what you want to put out there to the world? Because your name is on it. And so you really want to be careful about what you're representing in the game.
So what advice then would you have for new indies who maybe don't have much of a budget or access to someone like yourself, and you know, they're starting their planning to release their game internationally?
Well, I think one of the most important things that indies need to do, I mean, first of all, you really need to focus on your creative vision and stick to it. So if that's the game you want to make, then make that game. But make sure that you're aware of whatever you're representing in the game. So let's say you have some real world culture in the game, or even if it's a fantasy culture that might be based on a real culture, you still have to be careful, because if people recognize elements in that fantasy character, they'll say, hey, that kind of looks like the people of Cambodia, you know, and then you make those fantasy characters do things that the Cambodian culture would not do. Well, then that's sort of a form of cultural / political statement that you're making, even if you don't intend to. And so you need to step back from your creation and kind of look at it with a critical eye and just think about that kind of stuff. Just kind of go through it and say, why does that character look that way? What does that symbol mean? Where did we get the inspiration? Step back a little bit, and I know it's really hard for creatives because you're so close to what you've created. So that's where a lot of times get another person, get a friend from the industry, get somebody else, a colleague, to kind of step in and go through that critically, you know, and just kind of think about it on that level. You know, I do it for a living. I mean, I scour through content. I get paid to do that kind of stuff. And but you know, there's people out there who I think most people, especially, they're looking for what I consider to be like the knee-jerk reaction. You're not looking for what like a social science professor is going to say. You're looking for what the consumer on the street is going to say, because they're the ones who might complain. So, or the government. But I wouldn't. So my advice is don't worry about it too much. Don't live in fear, because oftentimes when I give talks on culturalization, I have people come up to me, especially indies, and they'll say, I'm really afraid of my game now. I think I've made a terrible mistake. And so I'm like, well, don't be too afraid. Like I said, you still have to stick to creative vision, but think about it critically. Step back and really think through that lens of like, who's going to be looking at my game and what might they see.
Mm. Do you think most indies are focused on North America and not really thinking beyond that?
Yeah, primarily, I think so. I think that's a huge focus, and it makes sense. It's a very large market, as we know, and so a lot of people just assume, well, I'm just going to target my content primarily for North America, and if anybody else likes it, well, that's great, that's fine.
What do you think they're missing out on by not taking their game to other regions?
The thing is, there's a lot of examples in game industry history where a game has been successful in a market where you never thought it could be successful or never intended. So like there's a game that's produced in South Korea, and I'm trying to remember the name of it, but it has to do with like medieval knights, kind of a fighting game, like a strategy game. And somehow this game got introduced into Turkey. And once it was in Turkey, it became like a national phenomenon. It's a game that so many people played. It's in the sort of the same way that StarCraft became a huge phenomenon in Korea. Why did it become a big phenomenon in Korea? It just caught on to the player's psyche at the time, and it just became like a social thing. I mean, the interaction of StarCraft in Korea became more of a cultural thing, that it's just something that people do. And that kind of happened in Turkey as well. And so you don't know who's going to like your game or not. Maybe you release it in North America, you get some decent sales, but then suddenly you see it spiking in Paraguay. It's like, why? I don't know. I mean, it's a really cool phenomenon when it happens, but you can't predict it. So that's why it's important to be thinking that there's a lot of markets out there beyond North America that could just as easily be a success for your game.
Are there some classic mistakes that you've seen teams making, I suppose, when they're not really thinking about the kinds of things that you're thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's really tough is the use of stereotypes is extremely common. Gender stereotypes, racial stereotypes, cultural stereotypes, because a lot of times when you're in that kind of intense creation mode, especially if you're crunching yourself, which you should not be crunching, but if you're putting all that pressure on yourself to just get something done, a lot of times that's when creative people will like pull stereotypes off their mental shelf and just say, well, I need a person of color, so I'll put that person in there. Or I need someone from Scotland, so they're going to be wearing a kilt and a beret and have a very heavy Scottish accent, and they'll probably play the bagpipes too. It's like, well, most Scottish people don't. They don't walk around in kilts. Yeah, they have a heavy accent, but that's pretty much it. So that's a stereotype. And but it's also a cultural icon that Scotland itself promotes. So you kind of have to think about who the character is supposed to be, because maybe it's appropriate, but maybe it isn't. So there's all of those kinds of things that typically happen, usually stereotypes and kind of rushing into it, that can be really challenging. And so what I often recommend, especially because being on a budget, you don't really have the money to go out and hire people to do this kind of stuff, but you could do research. I mean, there's all kinds of resources online, cultural resources. You look at Wikipedia of all places. I mean, there's other places to look as well. You can even ask people from other countries online. I mean, so one of the things that I've done sometimes is like go on Quora or Yahoo Answers or something like that, and I'll put out a question saying, hey, for people who live in Indonesia, do you think this is a problem if you see this symbol or you see this kind of character? Now, you will get, the problem with that approach on the internet is you're going to get a lot of noise and maybe a little bit of signal coming from people, but you might get, even if you get a few responses from people who seem sincere, they say, yeah, I'm Indonesian, and I think that could be an issue, and here's why. At least it gives you some idea that issue might be an issue. So you do what you can, just to kind of, and even ask your friends, ask in your community. One of the things that I know some people do, which I've encouraged them to do, is go, if you have a local university, go to the local university. A lot of times there's different cultural groups at a university that have like clubs, or they've got gatherings, or there's professors in certain regions. Just go ask them. They're not going to charge you money if you just walk in or, say, hey, I'm just curious, do you think this would be a problem? And so there's a lot of ways to do it very cheaply. It just takes the effort to do it.
Mm. Do you think it's possible for an indie or small game developer to create like at least some sort of risk assessment when launching a game?
I do. I do. I mean, risk assessment, though, oftentimes the assessment of risk is based on experience. So typically you're assessing the potential for something to happen, the risk, with some background experience. So it's a little bit tougher, especially if you're just starting out. So if like you're a student who's just graduating, you've put together a little team, you're setting up your own little indie company, you probably won't have as much perspective and experience. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it will be more challenging, because on what basis do you assess the risk of your experience? Now, again, like I just said, you could go back and do some research, and that could help guide some sense of risk. The other thing that's super important, though, in assessing risk is looking at precedent. So what I mean by that is that if your game contains like a certain kind of character or some content element, you can do a lot of Google foo searching online and see if that issue has ever come up in anything else, not just games, but in movies, in television, in books. I mean, look at other creative art forms to see if that issue has ever been a problem. Because that's often, I do that a lot in my work. I often will, use that to the advantage of the developer, because if we get pushback from a certain government, they say, hey, we don't like this. It's like, yeah, but you allowed this movie 3 years ago to come out with the exact same thing. So why are you biased against games? And that argument can actually work, to be honest. So think about the precedent issue too.
You've also talked about symbols and the meaning of symbols. I know even quite recently there was a game that released a piece of clothing for a character, a skin for a character that they had to take down because what they thought was just a few random lines turned out to be some kind of recognizable gang symbol. So
yeah.
there's all kinds of mistakes that people can make there as well.
Yes, and I know exactly the game you're talking about. So, yeah, I mean that kind of thing is also, that's really tricky, because then you're starting to get into very deep contextual culture. So that's symbology and things like gestures. Any kind of gestures can be really problematic. We all know what these things mean. Gestures like this. I can go on and on and on. Gestures are very, very context specific, and so you may not really know what that means in a certain context or outside that certain context. And symbols can often be the same way, because they're so embedded with meaning, but they can also be so obscure. And so you just that's an area where it definitely takes more research. I mean, even myself, as long as I've been doing this work, I have a stack at home of textbooks on symbols and encyclopedias of symbols that's, at least like half a meter high. It's just, there's so many resources on that. So I will often have to go to my books and do the research too.
How do you balance a team's creative freedom and then, I suppose, against the risk when they're launching? Because obviously they're very focused on the creative aspect, but there's a lot they need to be thinking about as well.
Yeah, well, that's a very important issue, because I fervently believe, even though I often get called the political correctness police, I get called the geography cops, I get called all kinds of names by different people because they think what I am is basically a censor.
Right.
And I can understand why they would see it that way, but that's not what I'm here for. My job is to maximize the reach of the content. And so what I try and do is look for those elements that are going to prevent the content from going as many places as possible. Now, for a lot of companies, when they hear that, they mean, that means more money, which it does, because the more markets you can go into, that means potentially more revenue. But the real reason I do it is out of respect. It's out of respect for the culture. You don't want to put something in your game that's going to knock the player out of the experience. They're going to be playing and enjoying your game, and all of a sudden they're like, oh my God, what is that? Why is that in there? And that happens, you know. So, however, so that being said, I do fervently believe in the creative freedom of artists, including game developers who are artists. And so I feel that it's very important that as a game developer, you should be able to create anything you want to create. Now, it might be the most offensive, vile thing on the planet, and I'm not going to play it, and most people won't either, but you have the freedom to do it, because games are a form of self-expression. However, if you want to sell your game, then that's a whole other story, because then you're not just creating art, you're creating a product. You're creating something that is going to be subject to market forces, and that's a whole nother dimension. So you need to have your creative freedom, but then you also need to decide what you're willing to do with that creative vision to change it if you want that vision to be shared by more people. So that's the big challenge. Is like, where do you stand personally, as if you're just a one-person indie, or if you're like a group of 5 or whatever? Where do you guys draw the line on how and when these changes get made? And if you decide, you know, if you find that, you know, we're going to release something that's very controversial, well, then you have to be ready to defend yourself. That's the next step. And that's something I help a lot of people do as well. If they say, well, no, we're not changing it because this is our creative vision, this is what we want, I'm like, that's fine with me. So now you're going to have to deal with what's going to happen as soon as this releases, because you're going to get a lot of backlash. And so then then it's a matter of, what do? You know, how do you explain yourself? How do you, you know, make sure you're ready for what we call the rude Q&A that often gets asked by the media or by other parties, like, you know, asking you why you did this, and you have to be prepared for it. Because a lot of indies I know, they'll just do it and say, well, it's my creative freedom, and then they're surprised at how much backlash they get, and it just overwhelms them.
If you could give 3 pieces of advice to indies or new studios that are launching their games and are thinking about launching them internationally as well, what things should they be thinking about?
Well, I think the first thing is it's super basic. Make sure you're using Unicode. Make sure you're following the basics of internationalization. You know, in number formats, calendar formats. With using Unicode, you ensure that your game, if you decide maybe in the future to localize it, you're already going to be ready for it, because Unicode will allow you to use all the different language glyphs around the world. That's a really basic thing. That's what most software in general does, that, not just games. So just fundamentals, like, you know, basic internationalization kind of stuff. There's all kinds of resources out there on how to do it. It's really easy and basic. A lot of stuff like Unity, I believe, and even Unreal, I think some of this is built in now, so it makes it even easier. The second thing is that I would encourage is think about getting your game localized into at least one language. And how do you do that, especially if you don't have any money? Well, guess what? There are tons of people out there who have translation skills who are dying to get into games, and I have no doubt that you might be able to bring them onto your team, you know, as a localization person on your team. And they might do it for free so that they can get credit. They might do it for reduced price just so they can get some experience under their belt, get a resume building thing going, as a lot of indies do. But imagine, for example, like in the North American market, when I hear a lot of indies saying, we're going to release our game there, I say, why don't you localize into Spanish? Just Spanish alone. You know how many Spanish speakers there are in the United States alone? I mean, if you do Spanish, you basically have pretty much the entire Western Hemisphere, minus Brazil, covered. That's a huge territory for one language, you know. And so and a lot of indie games that I know, that I've experienced, a lot of them are not very text heavy. You know, you might just have to localize mainly the instructions and maybe the UI a little bit, but otherwise, most games, they're not very text heavy, and so it's generally not that difficult a thing to have done. So I really strongly encourage indies to pursue that and at least explore it and see. Because again, remember what I said, it goes back to that thing, you never know which country might suddenly find your game to be amazing. So it's always worth kind of fishing that way. But if you make it difficult for them to understand it from the start by not localizing, then that's a problem. And then the third piece of advice, again, is kind of echoing back what I said before, which essentially make sure at some point you step back from your creation and kind of give it some distance. If that might be time distance, like you just stop completely working on it for like an entire weekend or a few days, and then come back to it with fresh eyes and think about that cultural dimension that I talked about. Like, is there any possibility that anything in your game might be saying something, or maybe you used a stereotype that's inappropriate or something because you were in that, that crazy building mode? Just kind of step back and think about, is there something there that might be a problem? And even if you're a little bit suspicious, you should follow that suspicion and research.
Fantastic. That was super fascinating, Kate. Thank you so much. That was incredible. How can we connect with you on social media? And are you maybe available for a bit of a Q&A on Twitter, that kind of thing, if people wanted to ask?
No, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm on Twitter. I'm on Twitter as Geogrify, which is GeoGrify. So you can always follow me there. I do tend to tweet little stories about different content things now and then. And people can always access me there if they want to if they have a question, a follow-up question, or just curious about any aspect of this field. I'm more than happy to help. That's why I'm here.
Fantastic. Well, if you do have questions for Kate, make sure you contact her on Twitter and use the hashtag TBoIG Summit in your question there as well. And there's also the Business of Indie Games Facebook group, which is generating great conversation as well. Thank you so much for your time, Kate.
Awesome.
That was fascinating.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Okay, well, thank you so much.